Biden administration announced new actions today aimed at strengthening access to contraception and protecting access to medication abortion. President Biden will also convene a task force today on the issue because today marks 51 years since the Roe v. Wade ruling, which established the right to an abortion. You might remember the Supreme Court overturned that precedent in 2022. Joining us now is Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan. She's a Democrat who represents the 4th District of Virginia. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us. Our internal polling shows that Americans overwhelmingly feel very, very strongly about this issue. What is your understanding of the stands that Americans have taken on this? What are you hearing from your constituents about abortion rights?
Well, what I hear across Virginia, my constituents and across the country, is the vast majority want abortion to be legal and accessible. Here in Virginia, we are a safe haven. We are the only state in the South without a ban or extreme restrictions, and people want our laws either as they are or less restrictive and do not want bans or more restrictions. And I think the same is true across the country.
I know you recently called abortion rights bills brought forth by House Republicans as, quote, dangerous. Is there room to compromise on this issue? Obviously, voters in a number of different states have voted in legislatures that are in favor of more restrictive abortion rights. Is there a middle ground at all, particularly when you see some of the proposals that House Republicans are bringing forth?
What I'm hearing is the middle ground is that decisions about health care in general and abortion care specifically should be between patients and doctors consistent with the standard of care. That's the compromise, because most of the restrictions that you hear happen in cases where something has gone wrong with the wanted pregnancy, whether it's 15 weeks, 20 weeks. Something has gone wrong. And when something goes wrong, those decisions should be between a patient and her provider without interference from politicians who don't understand what's happening in that specific pregnancy. And the reason these are dangerous is because often, even when there are exceptions for the life of the mother has to be septic. The mother has to be on the verge of death. They don't account for, can we prevent any damage that would cause her not to be able to have children later. And so, again, these decisions are best left between doctors and patients.
As you know, Congresswoman, President Biden and Vice President Harris will hold an event in Virginia tomorrow, Tuesday, for a campaign stop that is focused on abortion. They're releasing a new ad that focuses very heavily on this issue. What would you like to hear from the president? What would you like him to explain and to share his point of view with voters, especially in your state?
I think I want to continue to hear that he and the vice president are doing everything they can to protect access to abortion, to protect reproductive freedom, and leave these decisions between patients and their providers, which they've been doing for the past 3 years, which they will continue to do in another term, and to talk about how dangerous Trump presidency or a Republican-controlled Congress would be to reproductive freedom.
As you know, the president has, and Vlad sort of pointed out, is kind of recently, in terms of his campaigning, pivoted towards this issue. Right after the Dobbs decision, certainly Democrats were ignited. There was a lot of passion over this issue. But what the Dobbs decision did is bounce the issue of access to abortion down to the state level, which is where we really started to see things happen politically. So for the midterm elections, it was an issue that ignited people. But I think there's also a general understanding that at the federal level, there's only so much a president can do. But they can do some things. So you said, you want to see the president kind of continue to support reproductive rights. Specifically, what do you think President Biden can do in order to ensure access to abortion and in order to sort of protect reproductive rights?
Well, some of the announcements you heard today are a good first step, but I think the most important thing is who is the president appointing to the bench? Where we are, Dobbs' decision was a result of Trump-appointed judges. The Fifth Circuit opinion that we have seen around mifepristone is a Trump-appointed judge. So who is appointing these judges? but also the policies that you're putting in place. And frankly, you're right. We need a Democratic-controlled House and Senate, because my colleagues across the aisle have made clear in every single bill that has come to the floor, whether it's the National Defense Authorization Act, whether it is appropriation bills, that they will do everything they can to put barriers in the way of access to abortion, and they will adopt a national ban if given the chance. So we need both a Biden-Harris second term and a Democratic House and Senate in Congress.
How much of a role, or maybe you can break down for our viewers, the role that abortion played last year in the Virginia election? Because Democrats campaigned on this, so did Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin. And there was a notion before the elections, Congresswoman, as you know, that Glenn Youngkin was sort of a new type of Republican and that he might be a standard bearer for the Republican Party. And in fact, the reverse turned out to be true. You're not hearing that much about Glenn Youngkin as a superstar in the Republican Party because of the results of those elections.
Well, Glenn Youngkin has proven that he was just MAGA in a vest with a smile, but that he had the same extreme policies as far as abortion was concerned. Virginia voters overwhelmingly want Virginia law to stay as it is or be less restrictive on abortion. They do not want bans and restrictions of any kind more than what are already in place, and they want to, and many of them want to roll those back. So by saying the compromise was a 15-week ban, again, at 15 weeks, something's gone wrong. You don't wake up at 15 weeks and say, oh, I've changed my mind. Something has gone horribly wrong, either with the fetus, there could be fetal demise, there could be abnormalities that could lead to death, there could be something wrong with the mother. And those decisions people want in the hands of providers and patients, and they want their doctor to be able to make those decisions without worrying about, am I going to be arrested? Look, I almost died in childbirth. I was rushed to the hospital for an emergency C-section when my placenta ruptured 9 weeks early. And I had the peace of mind of knowing that my doctor was going to make the decision she needed to make in that moment to save both of our lives as possible, and at least mine. And she didn't have to worry about, am I going to be arrested if I make the wrong call? My daughter may not have that same peace of mind when she reaches childbearing years, because the Dobbs decision has fallen and because of extreme Republican politicians all around this country trying to insert their judgment, replace a doctor's judgment with their judgment. And the voters don't want that.
So, Congresswoman, Democrats maintain the Senate majority and flip both houses of delegates in the result of those elections. So a final question for you is, I guess, will we see nationally what we saw play out in Virginia? In other words, there are legitimate concerns by even some Democrats about President Biden's age, but the president and the vice president seem to be saying, look, if you want the issues that we support to be front of center and top of mind, you'll go with our ticket. And I think, do you think that that is a winning strategy if a lot of people are going to be concerned about other things that the president is dealing with, from what happened in Afghanistan to maybe even his support in the Middle East for Israeli policies?
Virginia suggests that is absolutely the case, that at the end of the day, whether it's Virginia, whether it's voters in Ohio, whether it's Kansas, that voters want decisions about healthcare, access to healthcare, to focus on the patient's needs and their relationship with their doctor, that they want to give them access to more health care, that they want to address the maternal mortality rate and the infant mortality rate. And it is President Biden and Vice President Harris that have been doing that. It is Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans who have been doing the opposite. And so I think at the end of the day, people will vote based on, what are the policies I want in place? What philosophy of judges do I want in place? And that the Biden-Harris administration will get a second term.
All right, Congresswoman McClellan, thank you so much for taking some time out with us this morning. We appreciate it.